Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and fellow Earthlings. As always, I'm Paul Mayer, here with Harrison Lambert. Happy to welcome you back to another episode of the Space Times podcast. Well, Harrison, thank you so much for waking up early on another Sunday with me here. Happy to jump on the horn with you again and run through what we're seeing in the industry. But big picture, I think we need to really give the Shenzhou 22 a big round of applause. They managed to follow and improve upon NASA's cycle in orders of magnitude. They managed to get some astronauts stranded on the space station less than a year after we did, but managed to improve that recovery time by what was it? Orders of magnitude.
Oh, many orders of magnitude. I don't know, what is it, 365 times faster, something like that? Oh,
Yeah,
52 weeks in a year. 52 times faster.
Yeah. It took us 9 months to get our astronauts back. It took them what?
1 week.
2 weeks? 1 week. Yeah. My goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. They took no rest. I mean, putting together this week's episode, it seemed like a very slow week. You know, too much turkey in the space industry. Everybody's taking a nap. Nothing much going on. But the Chinese, no rest for the Chinese. You know, makes sense. They don't celebrate Thanksgiving. They had no time to waste getting their astronauts rescued from their space station.
Yeah, super impressive turnaround. And I mean that comes out in the same week that NASA formally revised the Starliner contract. So
the perfect economy.
Yeah, it looks like everybody is solving the same problem in this last week. But so NASA revised the Starliner contract. Starliner is now only going to carry cargo for the next mission. No more crewed missions for Starliner while they are being sidelined a little bit. And then
it's unfortunate. Like Sierra Space had the same thing happen to them. Like what, a month ago, 2 months ago?
Was it that recently?
Yeah, I mean they have this human-rated spacecraft they've been working on for a decade, and NASA goes, "Nah, we're just gonna let you free fly it." And looks like Boeing's getting the same treatment, but I would say more rightfully so, having stranded American astronauts on orbit for close to a year. I think it's only fair that we take a breather on their spacecraft, make sure that works well with cargo before we go back to flying humans.
I mean, you'd think that this is something that folks would have been a little bit more conscious of and sensitive towards during the extensive engineering and development of the vehicle, but what do I know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a propulsion leak they suffered during the approach to the ISS. So it's a pretty common issue that a lot of these kind of spacecraft encounter. But, we don't, you want to play it safe when there's humans involved. So, it's no big surprise that a new vehicle like Starliner encountered these problems, but, they need to take some time to make sure that all systems are fixed before you return to using it for human spaceflight.
I guess. I mean, my point is more so that this is not the first time that Starliner has had difficulties. We've had failed rendezvous before due to internal timing, internal clocks. I mean, it's a $1.5 billion project. It's a $1.5 billion vehicle. A 95% accuracy or 95% quality rating is simply not good enough for NASA's crewed mission needs for human-rated spaceflight. So it's on some level it's a little bit disappointing and a little bit frustrating, I guess, to see that despite the price tag, there's still these same quality issues. But I mean, I guess that comes down to more of a human issue than anything else. Even after $1.5 billion, people are still people and make very human mistakes. But certainly glad that that all the astronauts stranded on the ISS and all the astronauts stranded on the Chinese space station have all been returned safely.
Yeah, I mean, overall, it's great that we can recover from these instances. I don't like to see anybody stranded up in space. It's got to be a, despite the astronauts being very stoic, it's got to be a terrifying experience. Uh, it's nice that we still have the Dragon capsules that are able to operate for America, just like China has the Shenzhou capsules. But we like to see a variety of companies that are able to support this. So good for SpaceX in the short term, not great for America. Probably bad for Northrop, given that the Cygnus XL just got cleared to do cargo missions. So now they're going to be competing with Starliner as well. But overall, it's great to see progress, even if it comes at the cost of the nerves of our astronauts.
Fair point. Fair point. I mean, that's not the only, I'll say, that's not the only limit in space, in human rated space transport, as unfortunately both the Baikonur Cosmodrome was damaged after the Soyuz MS-28 mission, and the Vostokny site got its power cut off 3 weeks ago due to an unpaid electricity bill. So
Yeah,
US,
Russia's not having a fun time either.
yeah, so stateside human rated capacity is taking a hit as we're downgrading Starliner to cargo only, and simultaneously Russian human rated spaceflight is also taking a hit after the damage to Baikonur, and for good measure, we're going to cut off your power too.
That's a good point. Like, like the reason SpaceX exists is because we wanted to get away from using the Soyuz as our only human transport to the ISS after the space shuttle was discontinued. So the Soyuz has continued to operate even though SpaceX has been flying for close to 2 decades now, or close to between a decade and 2 decades. But to see the Soyuz kind of crippled in this past week, it just adds to the list of challenges for human spaceflight. There was only one pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome that was capable of launching the human version of the Soyuz. There's other pads that can launch the non-human rated, so they're not completely grounded. But there's just this whole confluence of challenges for Russia. Soyuz has flown for a long time. This MS-28 mission flew an American and 2 Russians, so America still uses it. So this is rough for Russia and America, and they have no real fallback for Russia. So Russia's kind of fully grounded. America, of course, can fly out of Florida with SpaceX, but Russia has very few options. Baikonur is flying out of Kazakhstan, so it's not even technically a Russian space launch facility. Vostokny was meant to be the Russian space facility, but it's been plagued with corruption for years. There's like the construction manager was caught driving around with a diamond-plated Mercedes-Benz and locked up for corruption, and that set them back a few years. And now they're missing some few hundred millions of dollars that was supposed to go to their power bill, but now they're not getting any power, so that's going to set construction back even further. Baikonur with the destruction they faced with this gangway on the last launch is going to take a couple of years to get back up and running. Vostokny is going to take a couple of years, so Russia is really hurting for human spaceflight. It'll be interesting to see whether they find other ways to get their astronauts up to the ISS. Whether that be like French Guiana or partnering with SpaceX and kind of turning the tables from where it was a decade ago, or if they just say, you know what, we're going to end our ISS partnership early because it's only up there for another five years or so.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if Russia didn't try to leverage some of the launch capacity of some of their economic allies in the BRICS program. I know that China is currently doing that, so it'd be surprising to see Russia not try to leverage some sort of launch capacity out of Brazil or out of some of the other international sites that China is also working with and leveraging as well. I'd be a little bit more surprised if China allowed Russia to launch directly out of their sovereign sovereign territory, but um, I do think that Russia still has multiple paths to flight, so to speak. But it'll be interesting to see how high of a priority that remains for Russia moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I could see politically them partnering with China, no problem. I think the issue is going to be more of a technical one. Like, the Soyuz is launched on a Proton rocket. I don't think they can launch it on a Long March. I don't know if they can launch the Proton out of the space launch facilities that they have in China. So, whether or not China would allow them to launch, out of their facilities is one thing. Whether they can actually do it is another. I'm not sure why they're able to launch out of French Guiana, but that's what I've read is that that's an option for them. Whether it's the Proton rocket can launch out of there, or they can dock a Soyuz to an Ariane or something like that. It's certainly an interesting option. China, we just talked about them having a setback with the Shenzhou and the Tiangong, but they had another setback as well with their launch vehicles.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
The land space GK3 had an unexpected pause on their planned launch for November 29th. This rocket's particularly interesting because it's a pretty close clone to the Falcon 9. It's almost a blend between the Falcon 9 and the New Glenn. And it's supposed to be one of their, reusable rockets. I think it puts them in a good position to be able to augment their launch capabilities. But for now, it seems like they're stalled on that launch for an unforeseeable amount of time. This unfortunate to see, given that they've had a recent launch failure, I believe, with the Orion Space satellite or rocket a few weeks ago. So they're going to remain very dependent on the Long March. I believe it was the Long March 2F that launched the Shenzhou 22 just last week. So, maybe they'll provide the Long March to Russia, and that can help get their astronauts up. But I wouldn't expect that to be the case, given that, that rocket or whatever capsule they use was built to dock with the Tiangong and not with the ISS. So I think there's just a lot of the technical misalignments here that would not really help in the short term to get Russia back on track.
Some other updates. So Viasat 3, the Viasat 3 F2 manufactured by Boeing was successfully launched by ULA on an Atlas V. So Boeing isn't completely down and out on the map there. So they got a good win on the books. We'd love to see that. And I know you were excited about Oman's first geocom satellite, but tell us about Omansat-1, which is contracted from Airbus, but I believe it's the 6th geo order this year, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Viasat launching is a good signal. It's a geocom satellite that was ordered a few years ago, so it's just launching now. It is a cool satellite to see go up. The Viasat F3, F2 has a terabyte per second downlink rate, so better than anything we're seeing out of the LEO communication constellations, which is great. It keeps geocoms in the mix for options for telecommunications. And we don't often see a ULA Atlas V launch, but to get something that big out to geo orbit, you kind of have to rely on it. So great launch there, good signal for geo communications. But this Omansat contract is kind of an indication that Viasat 3 F2 is kind of the geocom telecommunication satellites of the past. We're not seeing a lot of satellites that kind of size being bought these years, or this year in particular. Omansat's a bit smaller satellite. It is a very advanced one being bought from Airbus, but it is Omansat, or it is Oman's first geocom satellite. So we see this a lot with some smaller countries. They tend to buy their own geocom satellite to provide their own telecommunications. This is coming out of a kind of pattern that we're seeing with the Middle East, where they're trying to get more space sovereignty. So I would expect to see some more technological sharing of the satellite between Airbus and Oman, particularly to their company SCT, which is their national telecommunications satellite company. So interesting development there, particularly for Airbus, since this is their first contract of the year. as you mentioned, there's only been about 6 contracts this year, so it's not like they're missing out on much. Thales is kind of in the lead, having already had 2 contracts between Space Norway and Sky Perfect JSAT. From my experience working in geocom in the past, I know both of those satellites are fairly advanced. So it's unfortunate that Airbus is kind of missing out on those contracts, but it will certainly be a challenge for Thales to implement. It'll be interesting to see with this new kind of consortium between Airbus, Thales, and Leonardo, how much that benefits all of them, or if it's still just this competition in the geocom market between them. But besides those two, there's another key player like Maxar who no longer exists, but they did get an EchoStar contract who also no longer exists. So that one's a bit interesting. It's a little old guard kind of going out with the times. But I think the more interesting ones to me are like Astranis got a Tsinghua Telecom contract. So love to see Astranis getting contracts. I hadn't heard of one this year. I guess this is the one. They had gotten one from like Philippines a year ago, so it seems like they're getting a lot of business in that kind of Asian Pacific area, which kind of makes sense given like smaller geocom satellites. They have a smaller footprint. They're able to target. They don't have to like waste so much of their kind of beam width over areas that don't have landmass. So it makes sense. Asia would want more smaller geocom satellites to kind of solve their telecommunications problems. And then the other interesting one is AscendArc, which I hadn't heard of that company before, but they're the 6th one. They've got a KT-SAT for Korea. So it'll be interesting to see, if they continue getting contracts in the future, and overall just kind of seeing how this shifts. I mean, 6 contracts, you're not going to see much of a pattern, but I would expect to see it shift away from Thales Airbus and more towards Astranis and hopefully AscendArc.
Yeah, AscendArc is one of the new geospatial companies that I've alluded to previously. They've got some really cool technology on their side and some really cool architecture to their satellites. So they absolutely represent sort of the new guard as opposed to the traditional bread and butter central cylinder architectures and heritage designs that basically everybody else you've spoken about plays in. So really cool to see them up there with that. One of the other things that we've spoken a lot about are the importance and the growth of the ground station and optical relay. Of the ground station and optical relay market segments, and we've got a couple of updates from both of those. So Astrolight has started building optical ground stations in Greenland, and Gilat Satellite Networks received $6 million in SSLA orders for ground stations to support uplink to LEO constellations. So we're continuing to see growth, and we're continuing to see investment and traction in those market segments, which we've needed to and expected to see in order for the direct to device market to wind up having any amount of competition. There needs to be more bandwidth and more throughput capacity for traditional downlink architectures and traditional downlink infrastructure. And so one of the ways that we expect to see that play out is with more proliferated terrestrial infrastructure to allow for greater downlink and greater bandwidth and data throughput overall, and seeing more of these companies getting traction, getting infrastructure built out, means that the direct to device infrastructure layer is going to be supplementary and not supplantive, which is overall good. I don't think either of us would necessarily want to see a complete transition to the D2D technology rather than show some differentiation or rather than show some diversification and see multiple different solutions and multiple different pathways for data to be communicated back to Earth. So
Yeah.
some fun updates in that side as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to like compare it to that direct device or segment that we've been talking a lot about. You know, when we talk about direct to device, it's all downlink stuff. It's all satellite relaying stuff back down. Most of it's relay, but I think it makes an interesting point that Gilat is using the 6 million for uplink to LEO constellations. This is more access to spacecraft and less so to do with data throughput, data, you know, transmission to on Earth assets. So like you said, I think it's they're going to be a symbiotic kind of situation. I think it makes sense given kind of the growth in the LEO segment that we've been seeing. I mean, just this last week, having Transporter 15 launched 58 satellites, you know, that's a heavy load on the companies that we do have, like, you know, KSAT and Atlas and, you know, established players. So having extra money spent on this is important to allow less stress on these systems, to allow more satellites and more companies ultimately to interact with their satellites without overloading the systems that we do have. So, you know, great to see. I think the more interesting one is Astrolight building optical ground stations. I am surprised to see this, as it seems a bit early in the cycle for this kind of technology. I mean, we've just talked about it maybe 4 weeks ago with a few different companies, like China showing optical relay between a geosatellite and Earth, and NASA showing optical communications between Psyche and Earth. But I think the more relevant one is Kepler showing optical communications between LEO and air. So, you know, most of the time we talk about optical communications terminals, it's from space to space. Rarely do we talk about space to Earth, but it is a really useful technology if you can get over the atmospheric correction problem to increase the amount of data throughput we can have between the Earth and the ground, and have it be another way of alleviating the stress on our ground systems for communicating with Earth to space. You know, I hadn't really heard of Astrolight before, so it's cool to see them getting in here with a pretty neat jump into this technology. I had been looking more at companies like Northwood, who had been really emphasizing the need for ground stations and you know, talking about their unique offer into this industry. But seeing something like this, where they're using a new technology to try to alleviate the situation, is really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, this is about having a diverse infrastructure set to solve the same problem, whether it's for downlink, uplink, or whether it's for traditional or new architectures. We want to be able to support data and communication and functionality across all of these different potential, I'll say, paths for data transfer. And so seeing that there is active traction, investment, and construction happening in multiple layers is encouraging to see. Speaking more specifically of the orbital sort of space-to-space relay and the value of optical terminals on orbit, Amazon LEO, formerly Kuiper, has signed a deal with both Crane Worldwide Logistics and Hunt Energy for tracking, monitoring, and secure comms. And in addition to that, they are going to be launching nope, that's Blue Origin, not Amazon Kuiper.
Yeah, one and the same.
Yeah.
Until like a week ago.
Let me try that again.
See, this is exactly the problem they had, though, rebranding the way they did. Is like everybody's gonna get mixed up between Blue Origin and Amazon, even though I use them interchangeably anyway.
In addition to some of those terrestrial communication relays, Amazon LEO, formerly Kuiper, signed a SATCOM deal with Crane Worldwide Logistics and Hunt Energy for tracking, monitoring, and secure communications. And this actually comes in parallel with Blue Origin announcing the launch of the Blue Ring spacecraft carrying some space domain awareness payloads and capabilities from Caracal, Scout Space, and some internally developed solutions as well. So Amazon and Blue Origin are both looking to sort of lead in the space of space domain awareness, optical terminals, and communication relay between both of these announcements.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense given how much money they have. They just want to get into everything. I get a little like fatigued reading all their announcements as to what they're building, but it's on some time scale they will get there. The Amazon Leo announcement is cool. I think they just recently transitioned their branding, and they've been launching Kuiper satellites pretty frequently over the past few months. So it's good to see them starting to spin up technology that they've actually deployed. So I can't give them too much grief there about their posturing, because this is actual tech that they've deployed. We'll see how the Blue Ring goes. It seems more like a demo mission where they're flying a few different products. As you said, the Caracal from Orbit Tech or something, Orbit Technology, and then the Scout Space Owl, and then their own internally developed payloads. So, overall, they're trying to become a space infrastructure company. They want to be at every layer. They want to be in LEO. They want to be in GEO. They want to do comms. They want to do SDA. Like they want to do it all. So, nothing new there, except that they're just like kind of laying out their plan. But I hope for the best. All those things are things we need, and I always welcome people with deep pockets spending money on space.
Well, you need deep pockets to spend money on space. And to speak a little bit more to sort of Blue Origin and NASA's strategy on things, this is more or less exactly what SpaceX started with. When SpaceX was starting, the view was that launch needed to be publicly owned. It needed to be government run because it amounted to infrastructure, meaning that private investment and the private sector would never be able to actually make a dollar investing and owning that service. And so what SpaceX showed was that with the right sort of government support, this type of high risk, capital intensive infrastructure, quote unquote, can be de-risked and can be privatized. The private sector can do that. And so we're seeing effectively I think a similar strategy playing out from Amazon, where they very much do want to be involved in all different layers of space infrastructure that are necessary, sort of to your point. And what SpaceX has been able to do is they've been able to effectively own that infrastructure and extract absolutely fantastic amounts of rent and wealth from owning that infrastructure, and still while doing so, bringing down the barriers to entry for players across the board, growing the market, and making a very handsome dollar for themselves. So I think Amazon's strategy is along the same lines of wanting to own extensive amounts of infrastructure that need to be built, that needs to be developed for the space economy, and be able to similarly extract rent effectively, or extract wealth at all of these different layers, while still bringing down the barriers to entry and providing valuable and critical services and functionality to the industry and the economy as a whole.
Yeah, I think my gripe with it more is just the way they approach it, just from a business perspective. I mean, SpaceX just has always seemed way more focused. Like they build one thing and it leads to the next, and that thing needs something, so they build that. Like they build Falcon 9, but they need money to continue developing, so they build Starlink to generate money, but then they need something to launch all those Starlinks, so they build Starship, and now Starship can get them to the moon, so they do that. And it just seems like they have a much clearer path. Blue Origin has always seemed like just we want to do everything. Like they have the lander that never got the contract. They got Blue Ring, which I've heard off and on for a while. They've got all these things going on, and it just feels much more like an established prime would do, like Northrop or like Lockheed. And we've seen what happens with them. Like ULA gets sold for pieces. The Starliner doesn't work out well. Like, SpaceX just seems like they have the focus and they make money, and the rest of them have money and they spend it and they don't make it. But again, like if they're willing to spend it, like the development is great. I just think that the lack of focus is going to hurt the company in the long run. But again, as long as the technology is being developed, I certainly welcome it.
Well, the only reason that it feels like SpaceX has a much tighter focus than Amazon space projects do is because that's a statement of fact. SpaceX has undoubtedly been one of the most focused companies in their roadmap and their product development and how they've gone about entering the space industry. Blue Origin and Amazon have been, to your point, much more sort of scattershot, trying to do everything at once rather than one thing at a time. Traditionally, one thing at a time always beats out everything at once, but that's only because trying to do everything at once costs a whole lot of money for a whole lot longer, and you never actually make any money back. But if your CEO is an eccentric billionaire who has more money than God, I guess we're okay losing some bucks here and there. If that's what we want to do, okay, sure, great. And you and I are fairly aligned on that as well. That like, hey, if somebody wants to come in and build all this infrastructure that we need, like that's great. Yes, and
Yeah.
we'll find a way to make that a good thing. But yeah, Amazon in their strategy and their execution regarding space has been decidedly, I'll say less focused and more diversified than maybe you would want to see from a strategy or an operations perspective. It's been working out well for them though to date, and I think that's largely because to your point, their growth and sustainability has been due to continued owner investment. But who's
I
complaining?
not me. Like I said, all I got is $1 in a dream and no Leo constellation to show for it. So I keep doing them.
Well, you and me both. So a couple of big updates out of the EU. The Space Tech Expo Europe conference occurred, I believe that was last week or 2 weeks ago, but that wrapped up November 26th and 27th on the most recent convening of the ESA ministerial. So that forum finished with a total 22.1 billion euros pledged to the ESA over the next 3 years, or annual budget for the next 3 years. The UK, interestingly enough, pledged I 1.5, 1.75, but over £1.5 billion, while Portugal pledged about 200 billion euros. So, it's very much sort of a diversified contribution, but it represents, I believe, a 30% increase from the 2022 convention, or I guess the 2022 ministerial, which is closer to 17%, accounting for inflation, which speaks to how high inflation has been globally over the past 3 years. But that aside, a $22 billion pledge, up from right around 17, 18 billion in 2022. Really, really clear indicator that the ESA and Europe are focused on space, that there is a lot of commercial, scientific, and defense priorities within the sector. The ministerial called out wanting to lead in space science, called out wanting to have dual use and, quote, non-aggressive defense capabilities, and called out wanting to increase Europe's commercial space viability. as three different reasons for the increased funding. And one of the things that we spoke about last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, but one of the things that we spoke about with the ESA more specifically is that the quote unquote pork barreling that you see in sort of domestic stateside at the state level politics is similar and sort of replicated at the national level in the ESA. So we know that Germany and France and Italy have some of the biggest players in the space, and that there's going to be a lot of reason to believe that, okay, so 22 billion in ESA funding, what's to prevent 7 billion of that from going to each Germany, France, and Italy, and for companies like, or for nations like Spain and the UK and Norway and Portugal and everybody else of the constituents to the ESA not seeing any of that back. So there's a lot of politics at play here on a very fundamental level. But I think the fact that we're seeing a 30% growth in investment and those three clear priorities spelled out, that's a pretty clear indicator that Europe is on board with and aligned on achieving European space sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, this whole forum was kind of a cluster to follow. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. It's nice to see that all the Europeans had a lot of thoughts too. It was just a lot of like, I don't know, opinions being shared, and like didn't see much like action coming out of it. But we've been talking about the action surrounding it for the past weeks. So a lot of this is just kind of politics, funding. Like there's not much that changed in terms of their planning, but it was very interesting to see kind of a lot of the politics going on between countries being brought out in kind of an open forum, and in a lot of ways kind of confirming what we've been seeing and what we've been hearing in announcements from countries and just like actions taken by countries. The fact that I don't like the fact that the UK is investing at all, let alone 1.7 billion, is huge. I mean, the UK is not even in the EU, so for them to be funding the ESA is kind of crazy. It makes sense in some cases. There's shared capabilities. I think they're still on the Galileo system, so it makes sense to fund that. There's some military purpose to having that defensive layer between them and the East, but I think it indicates kind of what a lot of these bigger countries, or economically bigger countries, are doing, is they're spending a lot of money on themselves and they're throwing a bit of money at the ESA. $22.1 billion is a lot of money. Like it's more than the $8 billion that China is allotting per year to their space program. So this should go a long way to helping them catch up. But when you compare it to like the 60 billion that Germany is allocating to their space program, keep in mind that's not 60 billion in 1 year. That's like 60 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. It's still not the whole picture. Like ESA is first and foremost kind of a NASA analog for Europe. So when they say they're focusing on space and science and some of these more altruistic causes of space technology, like that makes sense. There's still a lot of other money flying around for other purposes like defense, SDA, secure comms, launch vehicles, all this other sort of stuff. So it's not the full picture. 22.1 billion is a lot of money. It should go a long way to a lot of the space science stuff, and certainly will flow over into these other efforts that are being undertaken by the countries themselves and other inter-country agreements. I think I noted that Portugal contributed 204 million because it's kind of on the smaller side of the countries, and they don't have much reason for needing to spend on defense stuff, but it is I found it interesting because it was kind of a dichotomy with Norway, because Norway at the forum was complaining about how if we spend this money we want to actually see something come back to us. A lot of these countries that are getting money coming back are through the manufacturing and the money being spent on their workforce, and that's countries like Germany and Italy and France. Since we've been talking a lot about like Thales, Airbus, Leonardo, OHB, those kind of companies, but there's other efforts going on that are bringing money into these countries, like the Andoya spaceport that's being built in Norway. That one they've allocated 200 million to develop the landing technology for the next generation of Ariane rockets. And during the ministerial forum, they announced another effort to build a launch base out of Portugal, out of the Azores. So I found it interesting that Norway, of all countries, was the one complaining about not getting money back, because they are actively getting their money back, and they're likely contributing on the same scale as Portugal. And so both of them are kind of getting some money from launch bases. And it was nice of them to bring up that point. I think distributing the money fairly amongst all of the countries in the EU is important from an economic standpoint. But it's something to be debated from a defense and resiliency standpoint.
I mean, it's interesting to see the European politics play out. The only other forum that I think the best forum to watch European politics play out is, generally speaking, is going to be Eurocup. But outside of that, I think that ESA is a pretty darn good wind gauge for that. And I mean, to your point, ESA is the European NASA equivalent. How stoked would we all be if NASA announced that it was expecting a 30% funding increase year over year? Like that would be huge. So I think the fact that, like, yes, we've already alluded to the fact that Germany's contributed and committed 60 billion, and France has committed, I think, another 25 billion. We've already alluded to the fact that, I'll go ahead and round up, but there's roughly 100 billion of investment being committed independently in aggregate by the European nations. And in addition to that, there's the 22 billion that's being committed to the ESA. I think the fact that the ESA is experiencing a massive uptick and a massive increase in funding is pretty indicative of the reality and the importance of these priorities. I mean, Portugal is getting a launch site. Portugal.
Yeah.
I would never have thought Portugal would have a launch site in the Azores. That's fascinating. That's so interesting. And Norway is building their own launch site. They're getting a launch site via the ESA, presumably for some of the more polar orbits, because they'll be on Norway doesn't really have an eastern coast. Technically they do, but I mean, I think Sweden might take issue if they try and launch out of it.
I was going to say Russia might have an issue trying to launch a rocket over their country.
Yeah, so I feel like it's there's a lot of reason to be really excited about what we're seeing. Politics be damned. Well, there's a lot of reason to be really excited about what we're seeing. Politics aside, Orbit Fab secured the first stage of UK Astral and the ESA Artes refueling contract, roughly worth 1.3 million pounds, and this is to demo RPO and methane, xenon, and nitrous oxide transfer. And so this is some of the stuff that we've been talking about, and that we've alluded to with regards to space-based interceptors, the ability to sort of transfer, maintain, and cryogenically keep liquid fuel on orbit for extended periods of time. Huge challenges, huge problems that need to be solved in reaching that capability. And in addition, one of the other major sets was not just the storage of those liquid fuels, but also the safe transfer of those liquid fuels. And so we're already seeing those demonstrations planned out. We're already seeing those contracts awarded. So that's really cool to see, and we're excited about that. Additionally, Infinite Orbits announced the $40 million investment. This is following last week's news of their SES partnership. So they also have the French Ministry of Defense, the French Ministry of Defense, Hibiscus, and some U.S. Air Force contracts. So Infinite Orbits is growing and is doing very well. So we're happy to see that.
And this is also for refueling purposes. And I just found that the combination of Orbit Fab and Infinite Orbits getting contracts for this is interesting, given that it's the same week that ESA said they're not prioritizing RPO or refueling or any of these things. So, ESA Artis is giving money to the thing that they're saying they're not doing. Granted, it's only 1.3 million pounds, and that's not a lot compared to what they were allocating for it. So it's a small portion of what they're already saying. But it's good to see that they are working on it. This whole Orbit Fab collaboration is interesting because Orbit Fab is an American company. They're partnering with UK and they're getting some ESA money. So it's just this whole like consortium going on between all these countries to kind of advance this technology, which is good. I mean, Infinite Orbit's showing that like geocom companies want this technology to refuel and extend the life of their spacecraft. Makes sense. The geo industry has been saying this for a while, since they're running out of. It's kind of a dying industry, and there's not enough money to be launching new satellites. They've always wanted to be able to refuel it, but it's been expensive. But I think the more interesting thing here is that it's a national defense interest, keeping satellites alive, as you said, the in-space interceptor technology. Like having more persistent on-orbit infrastructure is going to require this technology, and it's good that Europe is recognizing that they need to invest in it because they're behind. There's been demonstrations this year from UK and France, so both of the countries that have invested this week in this technology, to show geo RPO demonstrations. So rendezvous proximity operations in geostationary orbit, so really far out where mostly geocom satellites sit. That technology needs to be developed because just this week, the Shijian 28 finished up its demonstration of refueling in geo, which means that China is far ahead of Europe in this capability. Honestly, probably as far ahead as America is, because I'm not aware of many capabilities in America of doing this. Like I said, Orbit Fab's an American company, of being able to refuel. Like we've had very few demonstrations, maybe the MEV. There's probably some defense capabilities that aren't known to the public. So I don't think we're that far behind China, if behind at all. But there is a real need for this. And I was surprised to see that ESA said they don't want to prioritize it. But again, they're a science agency. So it's good to see that defense agencies are kind of picking up the slack there, and that there is money going out to companies to fix this problem.
Yeah, very much agree. The fact that there's money flowing into these problem sets is it's a good thing. These are problem sets that need to be solved. ESA has been very forthright about wanting to prevent the militarization of space, and even their call out specifically was looking for non-aggressive forms of dual use defense. So a lot of the refueling and storage technologies are absolutely necessary and critical for national security. And so, they are secure. They are technologies, and they are solutions that need to be prioritized. And even if that's not explicitly being led or championed by the ESA, it's good to see that these problems are being solved through some of the other $100 billion or 100 billion euros that are floating around out there. Additionally, I think probably our favorite update from all of these is the SpaceFlux announcement. So Harrison, why didn't Slingshot Aerospace win any of the UK government's space surveillance contracts?
Oh, probably because the Russians took them out after they found their ghost satellite. I don't. They don't exist anymore now.
So to catch everybody up, so Slingshot Space had demonstrated their ability in space surveillance to find the Mosaic 6 satellite. It was a satellite that was effectively announced by Russia, but no details were permitted. So everybody knew that this satellite existed. Nobody knew where it was. And Slingshot Space, a UK-based company, went and found it. They demonstrated this technology on orbit, found Mosaic 6, and off the back of that major successful demonstration, they went out and didn't win a single of the UK government's space surveillance contracts. The SST contracts, all three of them went to Spaceflux. These multi-million pound awards from the UK Space Command and UK Space Agency were all gobbled up by a company that I don't know too much about.
Yeah, me neither.
But
did they find the mosaics? I don't think so.
But you know what? Good for Spaceflux. But it's funny to see the almost sitcom level of well, what do you want? Oh, I want this. Perfect. We've got that. No. That's all wrong. That's all wrong. But you know, props to Slingshot for finding Mosaic 6 and proving out their technology. I certainly hope funding and contract awards are quick to follow, because space domain awareness and surveillance are key components to some of the data infrastructure that we'll need. Those are going to be key in unlocking some of the upcoming and anticipated technological breakthroughs in the space economy. So a handful of different business moves over the past week, three that I wanted to talk about, and I'd love your thoughts on them, Harrison. So first up, U-Space closed a 24 million euro Series A to expand into the global small-sat constellation market. So U-Space has already launched hardware. They're post-flight, and they closed a 24 million Series A. Honestly, it's a little bit atypical for European countries. European companies typically have a little bit different of a fundraising and a stage, I'll say, description to American companies. But a $25 million Series A raise for a space hardware company that's already flown and demonstrated some hardware is smack dab online with any and all expectations one could have as a US based investor. So interesting to see that sort of follow up. But so U-Space closed 7 million euros in 2022, and the new 24 million Series A was led by Blast and the French ministry. So they've flown two of their own satellites on, I forget which transporter rocket it was, but they've flown two of their own satellites on previous transporter missions. We had Transporter 15 launch earlier this week, and so they're no strangers to SpaceX. But pretty big update out of U-Space. Good for them. And then the North Carolina-based Axtelis raised a $6.8 million seed round to fund their first demo imaging satellite. So I've spoken with and worked with Axtelis myself previously. Love the team, love what they're doing over there. Great to see them getting some traction and success here. And then last but not least, there's an additional sort of SpaceX's cadence of about 2 different tender offers for employees and early investors per year does not appear to be stopping. So their previous tender was earlier this year in mid-July. It valued the company at around 400 billion, and there's talk of sort of their next tender or a future tender coming at the end of this year or early next year, with the company valuation floating at around 500 billion. So that will most likely be to effectively offer a liquidation event because the company is private. If you own stock, it's not particularly easy to quote unquote liquidate or cash out with that stock. So this is likely going to be used for share buybacks from employees and from early stage investors, just offering an exit and a liquidation event to folks who want it. And this is more or less been their MO for the past several years. So no reason to expect that there's anything different or particularly unique about this one. But $500 billion valuation is puts them sort of right in line with OpenAI's recent secondary sale, sort of at the same mark. I think OpenAI's secondary sale was right around 500 billion themselves. So there's potentially sort of a similar race between SpaceX and OpenAI that we've seen between SpaceX and New Glenn in the, well, not specifically New Glenn, but Blue Origin, in the launch cadence and the number of satellites that we're seeing launched here. So we may see a couple of different races happening here, but would love your thoughts on those three, Harrison.
I mean, U-Space is cool to see. They're company out of Toulouse, which is kind of the aerospace headquarters, or one of the aerospace headquarters of Europe. So good place for them to be. That's where Airbus is headquartered out of. So, always welcome to see another satellite manufacturer stood up. It's following an interesting pattern we saw a couple weeks ago with Reflex Aerospace getting 50 million euros out of Germany. And Endurosat got like $104 million as a satellite manufacturer. And I think it highlights the importance of satellite manufacturing as one of the core pillars of space readiness that a lot of countries are recognizing. So good to see France and Germany standing up these kind of smaller companies to build out satellite manufacturing capabilities. I think the interesting one is the SpaceX funding. Like you said, it's pretty normal for them to do this, but I think it is highlighting that their value is getting very big. It certainly make them a lot of money to go public, but I think the messaging they've always had, that it's more trouble than it's worth, is standing strong. What I think the more likely scenario is, that always has been kind of floated, is that Starlink would go public. They would spin it out as its own company and make that one public. I don't know how that would work for the employees of SpaceX in terms of liquidating their shares and getting some money off of it, but it would be a very lucrative event. And I feel like it's more likely than ever, just given the situation they're in. Starlink with EchoStar spectrum acquisitions, all these partnerships they're having with Verizon, with Virgin Media, the Apple partnership we've been speculating on for weeks now. I could see next year being a very key turning point for Starlink to go completely commercial. If they can nail that D2D kind of product capability, then I would certainly say they're ready to go public. The development at that point is mostly maintenance. It's not this kind of launching tons of new satellites, getting wholly new capabilities stood up. I think they can get into a much more maintenance mode where they could be making a lot of money. And I think it would likely be that they see EchoStar with their $15 billion of SpaceX stock on the public market making money and want to take a chunk of that. So I will be holding my breath to see part of SpaceX go public next year.
So last thing on the docket for this week are some of the cool tech advances that have been announced in the news. And for that, I want to throw it over to you, Harrison. What have you found to be some of the most interesting stuff in the news this week?
Yeah, I think it's been a cool mix this week. Typically, when we talk about tech advances, they're kind of things that exist in our industry that aren't necessarily tied to business deals, but it's kind of a healthy mix this week. One of the cool things I'm seeing is a greater focus on space hardware particularly like electronics. And historically, a lot of the electronics we fly are not really built specifically for space, and we have to kind of harden them against the radiation environment and develop them for the given environment that they're in. So it's great to see that BAE Systems, or BAE Systems, has unveiled new advances for its radiation-hardened 12-nanometer RH12 storefront technology. This is designed for supporting space missions that require resilient integrated circuits. And I found it particularly interesting that they're working with Global Foundries, who's a very well-established electronics manufacturer. So I would expect to see them developing some very specialized semiconductors for space. I think this will help a lot with just the computing capability, and I would particularly expect it to help with these mega constellations and a lot of the talk we've been seeing about on-orbit data centers. A lot of that has to do with GPUs, but those GPUs are going to have to be supported with networking electronics, with power systems, and all the other compute that we have on board spacecraft to maintain them. It's kind of in that same vein. I've seen KP Labs and Front Grade Advanced announce their FDIR, so that's fault detection and something recovery. I forget the I one. System on a chip for space computing and edge processing. So this is kind of in the same vein. It's great to see that a focused effort on space-specific hardware that is really resilient to space environments, and this should help reduce the cost of the electronics that we put into the spacecraft and improve their resiliency against the environments, which should help them with lifetimes that are hopefully getting longer as we enable some of this on-orbit refueling and larger constellation and architectures.
That's really cool. I know that BAE Systems, though I prefer your pronunciation. So I know that BAE Systems has made a couple of acquisitions over the past few years. Do you happen to remember Ball Aerospace at all?
Yeah.
So BAE Systems bought Ball in February of 2024 for $5.5 billion, and then later on in September they acquired Kirintec. So Ball Aerospace was sort of a very similar to Maxar Technologies in a lot of ways, more of a satellite manufacturer, more of a bus manufacturer themselves. But later that year, they also bought Kirintec, specifically with the intent of enhancing BAE's cyber and electromagnetic activities capabilities. So it sounds like some of these acquisitions are already paying dividends for the company, which is cool to see.
Another cool cutting edge technology that I saw demonstrated this week, at least in a presentation, not necessarily the hardware itself, was the Hibiscus thermal infrared imager that's planned to launch on the Nano Avionics MP42 in 2027. I found this particularly interesting because it's a pretty rare imager to see used. Thermal infrared uses thermal heat signatures to image usually Earth. It's great because you can see through clouds, which typically we usually hear about synthetic aperture radar doing that, which has its own host of issues. But thermal infrared imaging is much closer to doing something like near infrared imaging, where you have much closer to like a RGB image, but in the spectrum that the imager can see. The issue with thermal infrared is such a long wavelength that to get high resolution images requires a huge aperture. But this payload is proposing to fly on MP42, which is a nano satellite, or it's a CubeSat. It's smaller, but they're claiming they'll get 2.8 meter resolution, and they're doing this through a deployable imager where they deploy multiple mirrors out in kind of a flower petal pattern and extend the reflector out on a boom, and they're able to do all this calibration and alignment of their mirrors to reach that resolution. So I'm really excited to see this because 2.8 meters resolution is really high. Usually thermal infrared images are more on the order of 100 meter resolution.
Wow.
So this would be a huge improvement in capability and add a capability that you could put onto pretty much any spacecraft at that point if it fits on the MP42.
Is more of the improvement in resolution, is more of that coming from the innovation on the deployable camera effectively, or is more of that coming from the low altitude or the nature of it being a CubeSat?
It's mostly on the deployable. I mean, it's a pretty unique design. It's an open imager, so it's not in a a shroud or two. So that allows it to kind of be deployed in a unique fashion. It's not purely circular, so it's a pretty unique approach to it. And yeah, just having these adaptive optics is a pretty pretty advanced technology. There's a lot of development going into that tech right now, particularly on the side of optical communication terminals, which we've been talking about a lot. A lot of those kind of tech that has to communicate to the ground needs adaptive mirrors to compensate for atmospheric distortion. So, some of the optical terminals I've seen have had hundreds of adaptive mirrors, and those are all individually actuated, and they have to account for microscopic movements on on the order of millimeters of motion constantly to counteract this. So they're using a very similar technology in this imager to increase that resolution, and I think it's really something that's only been able to be accomplished recently as this technology improves.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and there's some other really cool imagers that are flying around or being proposed right now on the non-Earth imaging side of things. So thermal infrared imager, that's for imaging the Earth. But we're seeing more use cases for imagers that aren't looking at the Earth, which traditionally have been frowned upon because NOAA doesn't like satellites looking at other satellites. You'll get in a lot of trouble if you turn your satellite to look in space. But now we're seeing some applications where that is desirable. We've talked a little bit about worldview and Vantor, Maxar, whatever you want to call it, doing satellite imaging for space domain awareness, which are really cool. They're really high resolution cameras that they're able to take very detailed pictures of other satellites with. But there's other companies that are moving into that space as well. So just this past week with the Transporter 15, the Impulse Space Mira flew quite a few interesting payloads. We talked last week about Samara Space's ultra stable platform, and that's that satellite's been launched successfully. So hopefully we'll be testing and we'll be hearing about that soon. Hopefully they're successful. They also flew Xenospace's Super Torquer. So a couple of really cool attitude control devices. But I noticed when I was looking at the pictures of Transporter 15 that there's another imager that was kind of pointed in a weird angle for what looked like a star tracker, but it turned out that it was HEO flying their Holmes Mark II non-Earth imaging payload on the Mira 3. And this is a pretty compact imager, but it's pointed in a way that they're able to image other satellites or just debris, and they're talking about using it for debris and obviously for space domain awareness. So I hope that they use it a lot for debris, because that's something I would really like to have us clean up our orbits, but obviously there's a lot of money to be had in SDA. So it's interesting to see that there's an imager out there being developed specifically for these use cases. And Blue Origin is indicating that they're going to jump into this arena as well with the Blue Ring spacecraft that you mentioned earlier. They're planning to fly a few different payloads, including their own, as well as a Caracal payload and Scout Space Owl, which are payloads we've been following for a while. They're very interesting approaches to this technology, and hopefully all of them work great, because these kind of imagers are, while they're not technically that new, they are things that we haven't really been doing on space for a while. So it's great to start seeing some heritage for these applications.
Yeah, that's really cool. So the space domain awareness is, I mean, a lot of that is knowing where the other satellites are. I know that there have been a couple of companies who at this point will remain nameless, but there have been a handful of companies that have wanted to do more close ops, like proximity imaging, effectively looking at and looking into other satellites to better understand what's going on inside of them. Effectively spy satellites, right? But not Earth observation spy satellites, but space observation spy satellites. And so a big part of the space domain awareness is still more than just awareness, I'll say. But so the HEO, the Holmes Mark II, what's the resolution? Like, are they able to do anything to the level of granularity that ArcSec and Neuralink are with their 3 millimeter debris or 3 centimeter debris detection, or do you happen to know the level of fidelity that HEO is aiming for?
That's a good question. I had forgotten about ArcSec flying their partnership with Neurospace. I'm not sure. It says 12 megapixel, 4 megapixel, 12 megapixel. I'm not sure at the distance that they're imaging what that translates to in what is it, ground resolution. It says 3.4 meters to 2.7 meters. So yeah, roughly on the same order as what you're talking about there. So not the kind of detail that we've seen with the Worldview satellite imaging, but certainly good enough for awareness, detection, kind of noticing when something is near your spacecraft.
Neat. I mean, you're absolutely right that that space domain awareness is sort of the fundamental and foundational level of I said it again, I'll say data infrastructure. Like, this is the layer of information and data that everybody needs to be able to know for things like on orbit services, for things like refueling, RPO, a whole slew of different markets and industries are dependent on all of that information already being well established and well understood. And so seeing the SDA infrastructure layer starting to build out, and seeing these technologies and payloads and terminals starting to get that traction is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like the initial use case is just monitoring your own spacecraft, checking if stuff's nearby. But it would be really interesting to see if this is a technology that kind of augments or replaces the ground-based radar solutions that are most common these days, and how they plan to network all these devices together, potentially create a more complete picture of the situation on orbit, and basically have a distributed set of devices that are able to map on orbit debris and satellites. One company I hadn't heard of, but I love their name, especially given what they're doing, is ACME Space. Unveiled plans to do hardware tests of their balloon-launched orbital manufacturing vehicle.
They don't have a mascot, do
they? I hope it's Wile E. Coyote. That'd be pretty good. Or Roadrunner would make more sense for a rocket company, but hopefully their balloons aren't dropping out of the sky and dropping rockets on people. That'd be a little too on the nose. But they're saying
on the nose if things don't go well, but they're doing great.
Well, hopefully they don't plan to start until 2027, but the intended use of it is for the Hyperion orbital factory vehicle. It's designed to carry 200 kilograms to low Earth orbit using a hydrogen-filled balloon, which is already dangerous on its own, and attaching a rocket to it is next level. But the idea is that the balloon helps the rocket overcome the thickest part of the atmosphere and requires less fuel mass and cost for it to get to orbit. Once there, the Hyperion orbital factory vehicle will be a microgravity manufacturing facility for biomedical and materials companies. So playing in that space of on-orbit manufacturing that we've been talking about recently, this would put them alongside companies like Varda or SpaceForge. But I think the companies that I would put it closer alongside and probably more interesting to watch them compete would be companies like Spin Launch or Ariga, who have unique launch approaches to launch and make much more sense for launching materials to orbit, since things like Spin Launch and Ariga have accelerations that would liquefy most satellite components that aren't just solid materials. So
right,
if they can get the cost down low enough, this is potentially a very unique approach to creating a scalable business out of on-orbit manufacturing.
Yeah, that's really neat. Like when you were describing the orbital factory vehicle, I mean, even though the name is pretty straightforward, my initial thought was that it would be something much more akin to a spin launch or an Auriga Space. Effectively, we're going to ignite launch from a much higher altitude than we would otherwise. But it sounds more like this is intended to be a this is intended to just be a high altitude factory, and there might not be the plans or the intention or inclination to provide launch therefrom. But I think, sort of to your point, that if they're able to establish and develop the OFV to the point that it is sort of a de-risked and reliable piece of technology that allows them to reach high altitude and to safely sustain that altitude, then you can look at the potential to actually transport material up into orbit much more cost effectively than we're able to now.
Yeah, and if nothing else, it's just a really cool way to launch rockets. So
Yeah. I mean, there's multiple companies that are doing there's multiple companies currently that are in the orbit elevation market or orbit alteration, but taking things from LEO and moving them into MEO or GEO orbits. So it's not a super far reach to imagine that the technology involved in OFV could potentially be used to elevate manufacture on orbit and then see those manufactured products or those processed materials be elevated to a higher orbit that OFV itself isn't able to attain or achieve. But that is potentially a very compelling price point and a very compelling a very compelling ability to overcome Newton's laws and get a whole lot of mass up on orbit for really cheap. Because hydrogen is explosive, but it's pretty cheap.
yeah, it's like half the cost of water, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Space Times podcast. I've been Harrison Lambert here with Paul Mayer, enjoying sharing all our thoughts on the news this week in the space industry. We hope you'll join us again next week to learn about all the exciting times in space.